these researchers did was they looked at all the different vaccine batches that were administered in Denmark, and they looked at then the correlating vaccine side effects that were reported based on those batches. And they looked and were able to separate these batches into 3 different categories. And here's the chart that you can look at. Here's the graph that we've got for you. So here you can see the blue bunch there is extremely high rates of vaccine side effects for those batches. Each dot represents a batch. And the batches that were given out, some of them had anywhere from, let's say, a few thousand doses to hundreds of thousands of doses in that batch. Some of the batches had up to 800,000 doses in that batch. So the blue line there represents batches that had a very high rate of incidence when it comes to side effects. Very, very high. In fact, it was 1 in 10. And in some of the cases, some of the batches, it was 1 in 6. Okay. The green line are batches that had a moderate number of side effects that were associated with those batch IDs. So they said in this case, the figure showed about 1 to 400, 1 in every 400, which they said is actually still really high for vaccines. When you compare it to influenza vaccine side effects, 1 in 400 is still very, very high, but 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 is outrageously high, where the blue batch of those different batches of Pfizer vaccine. Interestingly, the yellow line there shows absolutely no side effects. So there was a group, a significant number of vaccines, Pfizer vaccines, that had not a single side effect associated with them. So the researchers look at this and they're thinking, okay, well, why would a certain group have absolutely no side effects? And these scientists said the only time you get that is in the control group. That's the group that's given the placebo. That's when that looks like placebo. So you've got a bunch of people, and they said that yellow line accounts for about 30% of the Pfizer vaccine doses that were given in Denmark in that 1-year time period. 30% of them, they looked at that and said no side effects, when the other 2 groups had 1 in 10 side effects or 1 in 400, extremely high rates of side effects. And now you've got a bunch, hundreds of millions of doses that were given out in Denmark with absolutely no side effects. That is placebo, they say. So these German scientists looked at this Danish study, they see this, and they decided to do a little bit further research. And what they did was they looked and saw, okay, you can look at the regulator, it's public information, you have to request it in Europe, but the regulation is supposed to test the batches. So there is like a control mechanisms that, they get these large batches, they're supposed to do some control testing on them to make sure that the batches are good. And there's numerous reasons why you would do this. And there's different points of time of when you could also test a batch. So if you test a batch right when it's coming out of the factory, maybe it's going to show that it's good. The solution works or whatever it is that the medicine works. It's potent, it's active. But maybe when you transport it on a truck, maybe it's not properly refrigerated. Maybe it gets lost in transit and it sits in a warehouse for a while. Maybe then by the time it gets to the facility of where it's supposed to end up, it also doesn't end up stored correctly, right? Maybe there's all of these different sort of issues that can happen from the time it's leaving the manufacturer to the time that it gets injected into your arm. So at some point in this process, the controllers are supposed to test these vaccines. And what they uncovered through public information, these 5 German scientists, were that some of them were tested and some of them were not. But look at this chart here. This is in German, but ja is yes and nein is no. And the blue group, they were able to look at the batch number of the Pfizer vaccine, and they saw that every single one in the blue group had been tested by the regulators. It says yeah for every single one, right? The green group there, nearly all of them, only 3 there were not tested by the regulators, but every other green one there was tested by the regulator. That's the moderate group that had Still high of vaccine side effects, but it's the ones that had one in every 400 had a side effect. Okay, so the blue group had the really high rates. They were all tested. They passed inspection and they were rolled out to the public. The green one also, most of them were tested. The vast majority were tested and they all rolled out to the public. Now look at the yellow one, the placebo group. Interestingly, when they went and double checked the regulation with the placebo group, with what they thought, well, the group that doesn't have any side effects, so it looks placebo, they found that all of them but one were not tested by the regulator. Not only one out of all of those groups were tested by the regulators. None of them were. So they just let them slip by. How could this possibly be? What are the chances that the group that got no side effects whatsoever, that looks like a placebo, that looks like saline solution, what are the chances that none of them would have been tested except one? When all the others were tested in the other groups, practically all of them. What are the chances of that? The chances are next to nothing. And do you know what that showcases right there? That right there shows the regulators knew. They knew they didn't need to test the saline solution. It would have been a waste of their time. So they didn't. And they released it to the public. And that was 30% of the doses. And they were placebo, and they knew they were placebo. That's what that looks like. This obviously needs to be investigated. And we would like to see this investigated here in the United States as well. Were they doing this? And where were they doing this? Did they notify people that they potentially were getting a placebo? Did they know that, were the people aware that they were in a clinical trial, essentially? That's what that is. That is a test. You are a test subject. They rolled this out to the public. They, in some of the arms, injected the real stuff. And in many of the arms, 30%, they injected the fake stuff. They knew it. And they were collecting data. Here's what's also really interesting. Look back at the blue group. This is the group that had 1 in 6, 1 in 10, 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 had side effects from this group, okay? All of them were tested. What's interesting, go back to the other chart. What's interesting here is the number of doses that were administered in those groups that had 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 side effects, extremely high rates. The doses there, look at that top one, 11,700 doses. The highest number is 73,710 doses. Okay, that's the most doses that they rolled out of that group that had 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 side effects. Go over to the green and the yellow. Look at the numbers of doses in some of those groups. 262,000, 595,000, 814,000, 381,000. I mean, and then you go to the yellow, the placebo, potentially the placebo group, 485,000, 163,000, 205,000. Hundreds of thousands of doses were given out in these other two groups. So the researchers are looking at that blue group where people were reporting an extremely high rate of vaccine side effects. And they believe that what happened was when the regulators saw that, they pulled it. So it's possible that the blue ones were bad batches, really bad batches. 1 in 6, 1 in 10 people getting a side effect. That's a really bad batch. It could be that it was an intentional batch, and that they were experimenting on the people, giving them this extra dose of something that had something different in it that they were testing, because it looks like if they were giving people placebos, that they were experimenting on people. There's no other way to slice it. And the only other thing that's possible is that they were covering up for the massive number of side effects, that they realized, oh crap, our vaccine causes an outrageous number of side effects. And the only way to mitigate it, to keep the public calm and to keep taking our injection, is to give a chunk of them a placebo. We know they won't get a side effect from that. And so the overall rate of side effects will be way lower. So it's either one of the two. Because if they knowingly rolled out a placebo, that this wasn't just a bad batch that lost its potency in transit, that just wasn't refrigerated. No, that's not how they knowingly chose not to test the placebo group. That means they knew it was a placebo. That's not just they rolled it out and something happened. It became ineffective. It just wasn't refrigerated. And so everybody got a ineffective jab. That's not what that looks like. So the blue group, it's possible that this was a different formulation. And they rolled it out there as they were experimenting on people, saying one group gets the placebo, like 30% placebo, 30% getting this moderate side effect one. And maybe they had 30% of the doses for this heavy one that they were testing out. Maybe it was more like a Moderna, level where it was more potent. And they rolled it out and said, oh, crap, ooh, that one's really causing a lot of harm. We better roll it back. And each time they did it when they got to, under 75,000 jabs. And they said, go ahead and pull that, bring that back in. Don't give out any more of those. Too many people are getting injured. That is what this is looking like. This is criminal. But those people that really wanted this vaccine, for them to find out that they were maybe part of an experiment where there was a 30% chance they didn't get the real thing, they would be outraged. The rest of us should be outraged as well, that we said they were experimenting. This was an experiment. And this study that has come out of Denmark, when they looked at all the vaccines and the batches that were given to all the Danish people, and they were able to see that there was these trends, and it shouldn't have this kind of trend. It should be pretty much even all across the board. But they found 3 different groups, and they found that blue group, they pulled those vaccines quietly out of the market before they hit 75,000 jabs when they realized 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 were getting sick.